Howard Schmidt was the United States cyber czar for 2 presidents, George W. Bush, a Republican, and Barack Obama, a Democrat. Before that, he ran security at Microsoft, and later practically rescued eBay. He would come by the offices at ZDNet and CNET, and later I would meet up with him at RSA and Black Hat. Once he introduced me to a room full of government people by citing my journalism and then concluding, "Vimosi gets it." That was around the time that I'd gotten my CISSP certificate. And I have a chapter in my first book where I talk with Howard about mobility and how we have a chance to secure that and do it right. Unfortunately, Howard died of a brain tumor in March of 2017. He didn't say it first, but he did say it often. We need to build in security, not bolt it on. And that's been kind of a mantra in the back of my mind throughout my career. I see a lot of Band-Aids in the security market today. Products that do protect, but they don't really solve the underlying problems. They're superficial. They get the job done quickly, but they don't do anything to address the underlying issues that keep flaring up again and again and again. So I was happy to see Jen Easterly, director of CISA, announce Secure by Design program at RSAC. The same concept, only now she asked industry leaders to sign a pledge to go public with their commitment to the idea of fixing problems at their root, to build on security, not bolt it on later. In a moment, I'll reintroduce you to someone who's looking at the software bill of materials for firmware, among other things, to get to the core of the problem and start securing our IoT and OT devices in the home and in the field. This is a story about how we have a chance to do IoT and OT security right by looking at the firmware as well as the software in our supply chains. I'm Robert Vimosi. This is Error Code.
I'm Tom Pace, co-founder and CEO of NetRise, a supply chain risk management company that got its start in the firmware and embedded operating system space and is now extended into many other device types, such as containers, servers, and traditional IT endpoints. We identify vulnerabilities and risks, generate SBOMs, and help people prioritize vulnerabilities and exploits across their entire supply chain risk management attack surface.
You may remember Tom. I interviewed him in episode 30, where we talked about IoT vulnerabilities and consumer IoT labels. Well, that interview kind of went off the rails, and I expect this interview to do so as well. I met up with Tom again at RSAC in May. What I like about Tom are the truth bombs that he delivers about the industry that we're in. He just mentioned SBOMs, which are software bills of material that show what third-party proprietary and open-source packages are in our devices. How did he hit upon that for firmware?
I identified that particular problem initially when I was at the Department of Energy doing some ICS security work where I was tasked with helping to determine the impact of various vulnerabilities and risks against those devices. And one of the questions I would be asked was, can you figure out where this particular software component is across all of these different devices? Because we have intelligence that indicates there's a problem associated with that particular component. So if you think about the OpenSSL component in Heartbleed as an example, and what I quickly realized was we had no technical capability whatsoever at the time to answer that question. Frankly, we have very, very, very few, even today, that can answer that question in any meaningful way. And then I went to a company called Cylance where I ran a lot of IoT firmware and embedded system engagements that basically would go through and identify all these vulnerabilities and risks that exist within, automotive, medical devices, ICS and OT things, and we would have the ability to identify a number of components in a very manual, non-automated fashion. And so I started this company to really automate and productize all of that. And I think there's a misconception that we started this company with the knowledge of it, what SBOMs were. We did not. Like, they were a thing, like they existed, but they weren't anywhere near what they are now. So, we started in December 2020, and the SBOM momentum really picked up 6 months after that. And then you had the executive order in May of 2021 that really, lit a fire under a lot of this. So we also recognized that if we could generate an SBOM for firmware, that doing it for other things would be significantly easier. And so that would give us a strong intellectual property moat in terms of moving into other device types to cover, like containers and servers and whatever. And that's proved to be true. So every once in a while I get something right, which is nice.
Were these open source vulnerabilities that were identified, or were they proprietary?
Yeah, I think it started with open source stuff. But then, this was a role where I had a clearance, and so there would be some scenarios where we would get intelligence that would indicate there's a problem in this thing, and that particular thing might just be a first-party component or a proprietary, whatever. And sometimes that thing could be a software component, or it could be a hard-coded credential, or it could be just the device itself, where there would just be indicators that a bad thing is happening to this thing, and we don't know what it is, maybe, right? But this behavior is happening, and we need to know why. And so just the ability to have somewhere to start was really missing, versus if you think about a laptop, you have Tenable installed, you have CrowdStrike installed, you can interact with the operating system in a very, very different way than you can for a lot of these other devices. You as an end user can't really install an agent on the vast majority of these devices for a number of reasons. So it would really range, but the problem's exactly the same, whether you need to find OpenSSL or whether you need to find a component that's called, proprietary component 1. Doesn't really matter. But I would say probably most of the things we were looking for at the time were probably related to open source for the most part.
I'm very familiar with the software composition analysis space, and looking at software code itself, which is accessible. Firmware isn't necessarily accessible. NetRise is perhaps the only company that has invested significantly in creating software bills and materials for firmware. What were some of the challenges in extracting the code and then looking at it to get the SBOM?
I get frustrated always saying this, but it's unfortunately the case. It really depends. Some of the firmware you can get because it's publicly available. Just download it. Some of it is you have to have a support account to log in and get it. So, there's just this wide spectrum of acquisition of firmware. The biggest pain is when you need to physically acquire it off of a device. And that's particularly problematic when you're talking about doing that for a device that's in the field operating functionally. Like, good luck convincing an OT engineer that you're going to go dump the firmware off of a PLC that's actively operating. No, you're not. You'd run into some of those challenges for sure. You just have this big spectrum of things. Some of it's real easy, and some of it's, very, very difficult. So it just depends. But then you could also do things like reach out to the device manufacturers themselves, and if you needed to, go through like a formal request process and stuff like that. So there's a number of ways to go about doing this.
So for a bad actor, it seems like they could do the same steps.
They can just go buy the device. Like, that's always the funny thing about this to me. They're like, well, we're not going to give you the firmware. I'm like, Are you going to prevent me from buying your device? No, probably not. And if you're going to prevent me from buying it, okay, I'll have my friend buy it. It's kind of like a nonsensical thing to go through all this to make it hard to get your hands on. But I suppose some barrier stops some people. So
I'm always interested in how IoT and OT became attack vectors. One can argue attacks against devices, well, they've always been.
They are the oldest attack vector by definition. So they were the only things that existed. So they were the only things that could be attacked before you had traditional operating systems. So you had, whenever we built the internet, it was built on telecommunications equipment. So obviously those are the things that were targeted to be compromised because those are the only things that could be targeted and could be compromised. So it's interesting to me that this dynamic that has come along, which I'm happy about, obviously, it's good for business. In that sense, I'm happy about it, not happy about it in terms of the negative consequences that come as a result. But it's interesting to me that people have this misconception that this is a new problem when, and by definition, it's literally the oldest problem.
I'm curious, though, does Tom have any insights into why hardware security wasn't developed in parallel with software security? In other words, over the last 20 years, we've focused a lot on the code, like static code analysis and code exploitation and network attacks. But to Tom's point on devices, these have been out there in the field for a long time. And now, all of a sudden, there's been an emphasis on devices as an attack vector. Why the sudden interest?
I think that there's a few reasons. One of the reasons would be like cybersecurity solutions for some of these problems have gotten quite good. So if you look at the CrowdStrikes of the world and SentinelOnes and these endpoint protection platforms, do a pretty good job of keeping people out of systems. And by the way, that's just what's on the endpoint. That's not talking about spam filters and next generation firewalls from the likes of Palo Alto. And so to get code to execute on an endpoint these days in a well implemented security stack it's not impossible, obviously, but it's tricky. And so when you take the inverse of that, which has obviously been happening in the news, why would you try to get code to execute on an endpoint knowing what you need to navigate when a firewall is connected directly to the internet by definition? And it's pretty well established that the components running on devices like that are never fully up to date, which means they're always going to have vulnerabilities. And this has been shown with, Palo Alto and Fortinet, and Avanti. None of these, every vendor has this problem. This is not unique to those three. There's not one device manufacturer on planet Earth that doesn't have this issue, which also goes for Microsoft, right? Obviously, Microsoft has their own special day once a month, right? So this is not an indictment against any of these companies. I think it just became like a realization because as you solve or mostly solve other sets of problems, you begin to focus on new sets of problems. And the attackers they react to that, obviously. Right. And so as they begin reacting to that, they recognize that, okay, we need to start going after a different, attack surface because this other one's too expensive for us. And so where is there no monitoring? Well, there's no you're not putting CrowdStrike on your firewall. Do I think we'll get there? I think that's very obvious, actually. That is where we'll go eventually, because they're just computers at the end of the day, and a lot of times they're pretty robust. Think about what a firewall has to do for some of these big organizations. They got resources. And if you think about customers will be willing to pay for that, especially the bigger ones early on, the early adopters. So I think that's what will happen eventually. So that's why I think you see that'd be one of the reasons. You also have you just have more of these devices as the world begins to care more about automation and getting humans out of the loop. And COVID had a big impact on the Internet of Things market. Remote work obviously created a much bigger need for things like VPNs and wireless access points and all of these other things, because you have a centralized or decentralized workforce, and that has to be managed and secured in a way that previously didn't really need to happen. So I think you've just had a broadening attack surface with these devices that has just been attractive to, the internet ne'er-do-wells.
And now that the attention is on the attacks coming through the device and getting access to the private network, this is the trajectory that Operation Volt Typhoon did, a Chinese state-linked attack on the U.S. military bases in the South Pacific.
Yeah, that's a known, right? There's not... Getting on a firewall itself is certainly interesting because, maybe you can monitor packets and do whatever, but the real reason you want to get on there is so you can navigate to the internal network with pretty decent privileges most of the time, and in a stealthy way, and where there's no logs, and where there's no monitoring. And so, there's just a lot of benefits to doing it this way. Now it's harder. It's generally harder, right, to just, compromise these devices for a number of reasons, but it's definitely possible because it's been happening.
So, as a result of Volt Typhoon and others, there's a lot of talk of applying zero trust and treating these devices even at the network level.
Yeah, to me, zero trust is one of these things that looks really good on a piece of paper and whiteboard and has been implemented poorly, generally speaking. When you think about what enables zero trust, that's always like a funny statement to me. It's the exact same problem you have with traditional security. So, in traditional security, what do? You establish a perimeter. You do defense in depth. The attackers go, okay, good. You're going to establish a perimeter. We're going to attack the thing that establishes your perimeter then, which is exactly what's happening. So, zero trust makes sense under the premise that everything used in zero trust has been, written by God himself, I suppose, and is incapable of being vulnerable or attacked, which is not true. So every vendor that does zero trust has the exact same problem that every firewall vendor has. It's the exact same dilemma. Now, I guess, the difference is you can apply a different level of granularity to processes and users and parts of the network that allow for different types of access based on levels of trust. So that's true. I haven't seen a whole lot of great implementations of this that have been super meaningful. I think it's a very difficult thing to manage. On paper, you can't look at a zero trust. You can't read about zero trust and say, that's a bad idea. It's a great idea. Of course it's a good idea. Yeah, of course. The implementation and the practical administration of that, I think, is just very, very difficult. But that opens lots of opportunities for companies to come through and execute at the same time. I think the zero trust promise has been underdelivered in a big way. I do expect that to change, though, over the next 5 years or so, right? Someone will come in and just for the federal government and DoD market alone, you have a massive opportunity there where sure Palo Alto and Forescout and Zscaler are there. How well that's being executed, I think, is debatable.
There are standards. For example, NIST 800-207 emphasizes the importance of continuous monitoring, risk assessment, and access control in order to enhance the security and protect against cyber threats. Other standards, like 800-53 in particular, explicitly talk about firmware.
Well, NIST standards, every government agency has to adhere to NIST 800-53, yet they all get compromised all day, every day. Also, NIST standards are not really intended to be 100% compliant. 853 is arguably the best example of that. The word firmware is found 155 times in NIST 800-53. What firmware security solutions are all these government agencies using? I'd like to know. They're not all using mine. Some of them are. But You know what I mean? Like, so the fact that there's a NIST standard, I think, is, once again, you'd rather have one than not have one, but it's not a forcing function for people. It just isn't. It's a good guide. It's a good roadmap. It's a good common frame of reference for everybody to like aim towards, but it's not objectively solving the problem at the end of the day, which is just obvious.
So some of the attack vectors that I'm aware of are going after products manufactured in, say, specific countries for political protest. So being able to identify something that was produced in country X, an adversary feels that country X is bad, so they're going to target that country. Are we getting to the granular level where it's not just going after routers with open source attacks? Now it's going to be specific routers with specific makes and models?
Oh yeah, I mean, that certainly happens, for sure. I don't know if it's... I'd have to maybe understand a bit more about that reporting, but I think it's less about the country itself and more about the perceived maturity of that country's technical acumen as it relates to device manufacturing. I mean, just think about it. If you want to go target a consumer router created by a company in, I don't know, Switzerland versus the United States. I mean, like, the United States has better engineers, like at the end of the day. That's just like reality. Does that mean that the consumer device or the consumer router, whatever, made in Switzerland is less secure than one created in the United States? Obviously, it does not mean that. Obviously, that's not true. But I think you have certain brands that seem to be targeted, for sure, because there seems to be like this perceived notion that they are less secure. And then those brands are manufactured in certain countries. And then, therefore, those countries adopt those brands because maybe the people who own that company have relationships in that country, obviously. And so now those devices become targeted by other nation states for those reasons. So I don't know how much of that's political and how much of that is just like an obvious weak link that is going to go and be exploited as a result of perceived poor product development from some of these companies.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, unlike with a software attack, say OpenSSL, for example, being vulnerable with Heartbleed, that was across the board. It didn't matter if you were doing e-commerce or you were doing banking or whatever. It affected you. Devices, though, you can get down to the MAC address, and you can get very specific with the makes and models. Hence, you can focus your attacks on that particular device, as opposed to another broad device attack. So to some degree, the bad actors are going after specific parts of the electrical grid. They're not taking down, say, the entire electrical grid. Is that going to be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason for me to say that that's not happening or not possible. I guess the way I would think about it in my brain would be the reason they would pick a certain vendor would be due to where those devices are and the ease of getting into them. Because even though every device might have the Heartbleed vulnerability as an example, just because they all have that vulnerability doesn't mean it can all be exploited as easily in each of those devices, right? Like, there might be other assumptions you have to make. There might be other mitigations or binary protection mechanisms or something like that in place that would prevent a full-blown exploit and compromise of a given device. And what I would have to imagine is the attackers would be targeting things that they just knew that they had a higher probability of being successful on. And maybe they didn't want to burn a particular thing on a device to create any trace of what they were doing, potentially, right? Like that's the way I would think about it. But I might not be familiar at all with what you're, like the reporting you're talking about here.
At RSAC, there was general background conversation about a group calling itself the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, attacking U.S. infrastructure, in particular, small water utilities. I'll have more discussion of this in my next episode, episode 42. I find the vector very interesting, in that attacks can now get down to the granularity of make and model.
Like if we thought about Cisco as an example, like you'd have a difficult time convincing me that we're going to go target Cisco because that's like an American company. No, I mean, you're going to target Cisco because they're everywhere. like you're just going to have a tough time really convincing me that like, no, we're going after them because those are the Americans and we hate freedom. Like, okay, I mean, or it's because their devices run the entire internet. Like that seems more likely to me. That'd be like saying people went after the Fortinet firewalls in Guam because, you know, the CEO's Chinese or something. Or because the Fortinet firewalls were the firewalls that were on that military base that was in Guam and that is strategically important to someone. That seems much more likely to me. Right? Like that's, you know, what's the, is it what, Occam's razor? The most likely answer is the most likely, you know, listen, no one likes putting on their tinfoil hat more than me. Like, you know, I think there's a lot of rationale and reasons for things that are not obvious.
Cisco is really important in the space, along with Fortinet, Avante, and Palo Alto networks, among others. Here, critical vulnerabilities need to be addressed ASAP. Shining a light on something and making that public, well, that's still a difficult call. We need to treat public disclosure as a last resort. How does Tom feel about the recent public disclosures from CISA about some of these flaws in Avante and Fortinet, for example, which were 10 out of 10 CVEs?
I actually, you know, I don't know what is all going into that decision because I'm not there, obviously. But it does seem to me that they are still viewing this generally as a last resort kind of thing. That's that. Once again, if that's not reality, then okay. But you'd once again just have a difficult time convincing me that they're just out there dropping Palo Alto 0 days publicly because they think that's good for the industry. Like that doesn't make sense. Because they also recognize that people don't do a good job of patching and updating things. Like they know that better than everybody, probably. So to me, the things that they're gonna like put out there, they put out there for a reason. Because this is especially important. And typically the way these things are found, now the Palo Alto one's a bit different, right? That was found by a company called Velexity. I actually know those guys very, very well. They're absolutely spectacular. So I think the issue that they will probably run into as an organization with what they are chartered to accomplish is that there's just going to be so many things that end up mattering a lot. It's going to look like to most people that they're putting too much out there or something, when in reality it's just like, no, a lot matters. Like there's just like a lot of problems, and so I think that'll be just a dynamic that they have to navigate appropriately. So I don't think they're being, I don't know. I don't think they're being like overly, you know, it's Thursday at RSA here, so my brain it's having a hard time finding vocabulary. But you know what I mean? I don't think they're being too aggressive in putting out vulnerabilities that people need to address, especially as it relates to something like a Palo Alto vulnerability that's being actively exploited. Everyone's using Palo Altos, right? And if they have evidence, right? Here's the other thing that CISA has to contend with. CISA doesn't like come out and just tell everyone like how they get this information, right? Because they probably can't do that. And some of that information might come from, you know, other people in the government. And if there's other people but those other people in the government aren't really in the position. That's not their job to say, hey, everyone, you should know about this. No, that's CISA's job. But CISA can't come out and say, like, hey, the NSA told us about this or something like that, right? So they just are always going to have this criticism that they might necessarily not be able to, they just might not be able to defend it. They might just have to say, like, yep, all we can tell you is that you should fix it. Right? We're not going to tell you how we found it or how that happened or why we know it's an issue, but here's the patch, and people will figure it out eventually because they, will reverse engineer things or whatever. But, that's a problem that they have, right? That they're obviously, they have relationships with these other agencies, and those other agencies are going to tell them about things that are really important, and then it's his job to get that out, and it's just part of the deal. So,
in a previous episode, episode 30, Tom discussed some concerns he has around CVEs, and in particular how the CVSS scores assigned to those don't take into account enough real-world data to be useful. Are CVEs and the way we calculate CVSS still meaningful for IoT and OT?
I think CVSS has ran its course. There's a lot of other data that's even publicly available that you can lay on top of vulnerability information like CVSS scores that give you much, much better ways to prioritize over low, medium, high critical from a CVSS perspective. Are there publicly available exploits? Are those exploits actively being used in the wild? Like things like that are not super available as it relates to just the CVSS score. You'll find oftentimes critical vulnerabilities. This is a generalization. We do have some really good data at NetRise that supports a lot of this, but you'll find a lot of critical vulnerabilities aren't actually being actively exploited, and the mediums and the highs are, which is interesting. Because critical is based on a CVSS score, it doesn't have the context of what's actively being exploited all around the world. It doesn't have that. It can't have that. Well, it could, but relying on the NVD at this point is, a lost cause. So, but that is something that, like we do and other vendors can do, and provide that additional context over. They just say, here's a CVE, like in a vacuum, basically, and that's how they come up with the CVSS. And that's not nothing. We shouldn't ignore it, but it shouldn't be the be-all, end-all, and only prioritization metric that we use.
Right. And I've heard that you can look at the chaining that goes on with these medium exploits because, well, they're piggybacked, and that can lead to a larger attack.
And that's exactly what we do for traditional IT assets. Laptops, we operate under these assumptions that we have admin access to a box right? But then when you look at this from a embedded operating system or firmware perspective, none of that leniency is provided. They're like, well, you'd have to be on the box. And it's like, well, yeah, that's true. Just like for the vast majority of Windows CVEs, you have to have local admin or system, or whatever these wild assumptions are. But then in firmware, they're just they just ignore those. Those don't count for some reason. Right. And it's why is that? And I don't have a good answer for that, I don't think. But it doesn't make sense, that I know for sure.
Going back to devices, aren't they more permissive by nature? They're less restricted because there's an underlying assumption that only a few people would have physical access to it. So why bother restricting or authorizing or even authenticating users?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, that is I guess that would be an argument you can make. But the flip side of that is if someone compromises, Tom in accounting's laptop, what's the potential impact there? Obviously it depends what's on his computer and what he's responsible for and what else that person would have access to. If someone compromises your border router,
game over.
That's what I mean, right? So, just go ask someone Go ask companies, how many of them are using MFA for like accessing their firewall? Once again, it's like, why is this viewed so differently? Because time to access matters more? I mean, to me, that just sounds like an opportunity for a different type of multi-factor authentication. I mean, it's not like, I don't know, sit down and think about it, people. I can only solve one problem at a time. So, I mean, the idea that this has been a problem for decades and no one could come up with an alternative solution seems, I don't know, a bit unlikely.
Here at RSAC, Jen Easterly and CISA got a number of CEOs to pledge their companies to follow Secure by Design practices. What does Tom think about this, and will it move the needle?
Well, I think what I like that I'm seeing is that you're having a pretty significant sea change, just in general. You have the whole Secure by Design situation picking up, steam. You had the everybody who signed the pledge, out here at RSA, which, by the way, I totally missed the boat on that, which doesn't mean I don't want to sign the pledge. It just means I didn't hear. I didn't even go on the showroom floor. So, I really just missed the boat on that. So, sorry, SZA, I'm going to sign it. I will say this, I do get a little frustrated by the theater involved with signing a pledge and making a commitment, whatever that means. What's interesting to me, once again, is it better than nothing? Of course it is. Would I say don't do it? No. But man, these same agencies and organizations are literally the most powerful organizations on planet Earth. The United States federal government is the most powerful organization on planet Earth. I guess maybe you could make the argument that the Catholic Church might be the most powerful organization. I don't know. It's number one or two, right? It's up there. And so what's frustrating to me is, given that truth, what we say is, here's what we're going to do. Sign a pledge. And it's like, that's the best we got. It's the best we got. That's like the equivalent of saying, this country invaded the United States. It's like, well, can we ask them to sign a pledge to not do that? It's like, that's not how we react to other things.
For example, in World War II, Hungary signed an agreement with Nazi Germany that Nazi Germany would not invade the country if Hungary declared war on the United States. So Hungary did. It is one of the few countries to ever declare war against the United States. And yet, a few months later, Nazi Germany invaded Hungary.
Yeah, weird that a piece of paper didn't prevent that. I can't believe it, And so, or with banking, did we ask, all the cyber criminals in the 90s, hey guys, we need a scout's honor from you, that you're not going to go take money out of these banks because the infrastructure supporting banking over the internet isn't in place yet. Didn't happen. So we created PCI DSS, and everyone had to adhere to it. And then we created Sarbanes-Oxley, and we created all these things that these banks have to adhere to, or they get phenomenally fined by, these regulators and the SEC and all these other things. So it's this idea that there's not a framework and precedent for applying the same kind of solution to get the same kind of outcome don't exist isn't true. It isn't true. Just imagine if back then we asked all the banks to sign a pledge that they're going to do their best. I attended a bunch of panels that, one with Eric Goldstein, one with a bunch of DoD people, this is a topic that is front and center for a lot of people that have a lot of responsibility and are tasked with addressing these issues. So to me, and you see the attention that something like Volt Typhoon is getting. It's really incredible. Where you had in February, Jen and Harry Coker and Paul Nakasone and the FBI director Chris Wray sit in front of Congress and talk about Volt Typhoon for 3.5 hours. That's not nothing. So there seems to be this desire to, I guess at the barest of minimums, bring awareness to the problem. But to me, it's like, what's the point of doing that unless there's also a desire to take some action on the problem as well, which I expect is the case. So to me, that's an optimistic future for addressing these problems and probably an optimistic future for what we're doing.
I'd like to thank Tom Pace for coming back onto Error Code. If you want to hear more truth bombs from Tom, check out episode 30, where he talks about industry and vulnerability ratings and why he thinks they can be improved. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Join us on Discord. Search for Error Code Podcast to join the server, or go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. Coming up, I'll have conversations about the recent attacks on small water utilities, and more on IoT security. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.